disability insurance scheme because the government has decided to revoke the plan to add independent assessments for NDIS participants. This step back is seen as a sign that the government's listening to concerns from the disabled community. The recent development is part of a larger conversation around disability payments and whether or not it's enough to support those people affected. Here to give me their insight is disability industry expert River Knight. Good morning, River.
Good morning, Sally.
So what exactly was the issue with the independent assessments in the NDIS?
There was actually quite a few issues, but the big one that stood out was that the people that access NDIS, they have a whole bunch of professionals in their lives that NDIS fund, as well as Medicare, that provide reports and recommendations. And the independent assessor was another layer that NDIS were going to fund to come in, disregard all of those professional reports and all of that information and evidence that a person has from the people they work with that know them, and do a quick tick and flick to then put them in a box and say, according to my piece of paper, it tells me you don't need this, we're going to fund you this instead. And it was very much a level of bureaucracy that was clearly identified to cut funding.
Right. Are you surprised that the plans have been changed, that those changes have been revoked?
Well, what we've seen in the response from the Minister and what they've released is that not so much that they've revoked it, they've said, well, go back and have a look. To me, I think they're very much about wanting to manage the budget within NDIS, which makes a lot of sense. However, the way that they've came across it and the way they've done it has put people with a disability in Australia in the same situation that they've always been in. They have to fight tooth and nail to get services that are basic human rights. And unfortunately, again, we've had a situation where we've had to, as a sector, and myself as a person with a disability, as a carer of someone with a disability, we've had to go through the ringer yet again to say, what are you doing? You're spending money, you're doing something that doesn't make any sense, and we've had to go through the trauma yet again to try and fight for a system that could be done a lot more sensibly.
I have, in my limited experience of speaking with people who are involved in the NDIS, that they note that there are problems with it, that it's not perfect. What changes do you think could be made that might make it more efficient or might make it get a better result for the people who depend on it?
Well, because we want it to be individualised, we've got to get away from tick and flick approaches. We need to have people that know what they're doing. So when NDIS staff talk to a participant to work out what sort of funding needs to be allocated, there needs to be someone that knows what they're doing. They need to be able to walk in there and go, you know what, I can see you use a wheelchair, so we're going to need to make sure we somehow support you getting a new wheelchair in a couple of years' time. Mm-hmm. I see you need staff for this. I can see you need that. I can understand what you're saying to me. That'll make it easier to say, you know what, we can't fund everything, but I can understand the things that are really important that we do need to fund. So you don't need to go to the steps of Parliament and protest to simply get something sensibly funded that's reasonable and necessary. And that's the experiences I had. If I have an NDIS staff member that knows what they're talking about and has experience in the disability sector, the process is really easy. And no one expects to get a gold Rolex funded by an NDIS. We're just looking at going, you know what, a friend of mine who has a girl who's under 10, who uses a wheelchair almost all day, every day, the independent assessor came into her home and deemed her not to require any mobility funding or support in any way, shape or form, and seemed to completely miss that she even had a wheelchair. If someone who knows what they're doing can look at a person's situation and say, you know what, I can see what you're talking about, and here's all those wonderful reports from the people that know you really well that are able to inform that decision, as opposed to going into a tick and flick process. So I think it's training and support for those NDIS staff to do a better job.
So then within that system, is there genuine recognition of those areas of expertise?
Well, not really, because the independent assessment program that they were piloting, the people that were recruiting for that were basically saying, we're open to new graduates, people who don't have experience. I've met people from NDIS that were previously administration roles that have had no experience working with people with disabilities. So we're not recognising that. And I think as an organisation, NDIS, it's massive and you need consistency. But one of the best ways would be to be working with those staff at the ground, face-to-face level, to make sure that they know what they're doing, because they're making decisions that have a huge impact on someone's life. And my friend who went through the independent assessment pilot, who had the report come back to say that the child that has a wheelchair almost every day, all day long, doesn't have mobility support needs, it was comical. And we had a laugh about it, but we were also very sad because we thought, you know what, that person now has to go back and fight to say, you didn't notice the wheelchair and you're not funding a new wheelchair, because children grow and every couple of years we need a new wheelchair.
Mm. The comment has been made to me in the past that whenever you have a system that encourages private enterprise into a support system, whether it be something like the NDIS or whether it be some other government-funded organisation, like, for example, aged care, you run the risk of the bottom line being the thing that's most important.
Absolutely. Privatisation has a lot of flaws and against. I guess from the perspective that we've looked at, it's been a business model for decades in the Australian community. Even if you're a charity, you still have that business model of, I've got to make sure my budget's sensible.
Mm.
So in some ways, that business model actually helps people do things a little bit, tighter. But we don't want to be a profit-based system for, supports around people's human rights. So, there needs to be a balance within there. And, I've seen that where a wheelchair costs $20,000 and I think, you know what, probably getting it from China for about $3,000. So there is that tendency to go, you know what, I can see where private enterprise is actually making it harder for funding to go further. But at the same time, there's also a push within private enterprise to make sure that we do things, I guess, sensibly. And I tell you what, if NDIS want to look at how to do things on a better budget, if they went to any of the charities around Australia and some of those small organisations, I guarantee they'll get some really good experts who will tell them how to do things on the smell of an oily rag.
Yeah. So then from your perspective, what's the best way for someone to figure out what sort of funding somebody might be eligible for? What's the best, most accountable and, without making it about making profits, what's the most fiscally responsible way of doing it?
Well, I think what needs to happen is there needs to be transparency and honesty with planners. So planners that make those decisions about funding and work out what funding to allocate each year, those people need to be supported really well within NDIS so that they can take all those reports, talk to the family and say, well, obviously we can't fund, everything because we just simply don't have an endless budget. But what we do need to fund is the things that are really, really important. They match your goals. They're helping you with your goals. And also, I know that you could probably get that funded through Medicare, so let's not double dip. At the same time, let's not have an independent assessor who's an occupational therapist when NDIS is already funding an occupational therapist in your life to provide reports. So I think it's about efficiencies, but also it's about just making sure the NDIS staff are supported well enough that when they're doing that process, that it's just simply a sensible, logical process, and there does need to be limits. But like being in Wagga, the situation and the things you may have access to in Wagga may be very different to living in the middle of Sydney. So the funding would be a little bit differently because of where you live. And there's a lot of different things that make people's lives complex and unique, and we need to make sure that we actually understand what those things are.
For the rest of us watching On River, do you think it's important that we, the rest of the community, need to be more aware of the individual needs of people who are living on NDIS so that, we can be more responsive to their concerns?
I think so, and it's very easy to do in Australia. I can guarantee everyone in Australia will have some connection to a person with a disability or someone in aged care. So it is easy to do, and if we can try and have a bit more awareness, it will get away from the politics. We saw Mr. Roberts bringing in changes to the legislation because he wanted to limit, some of the funding that was going to equipment because we don't have an endless budget, but because people don't understand that in the community, he has to go to the people of Australia and say, we don't want to fund sex workers. And it's like, that's not an issue. the issue is that you want to tighten up the definitions a bit in the legislation so that we can reasonably fund things the way they should be funded. So we don't need to politicise things, but because people don't understand the sector, we have to use politics to get things across the line. So if people can really, take that time to understand what's going on in the sector, that would be really, really helpful. And it's not a hard thing to do because I can guarantee almost everyone can find a person in their network that has a disability, that's a parent, a carer, or even just going into the aged care system.
River, thanks so much for speaking to me this morning.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.
River Knight is a disability industry expert and carer, talking there about the government's decision to revoke the plan to add independent assessments for NDIS participants. But as he said, that is not all over and done and dusted yet. On ABC Riverina Breakfast, Sally Bryant with you, and it's 27 minutes to 10.